My billionaire dad disowned me for marrying a poor man. At my wedding, he said, "No inheritance, no trust fund." My husband smiled and said, "We don't need it." 6 months later, my parents froze when they saw where my husband really worked. My father built a billion-dollar empire out of nothing, and he never let anyone forget it. What he never admitted, not once in my entire life, was that somewhere along the way, he stopped measuring people by who they were and started measuring them by what they were worth, including me. The day I introduced him to the man I loved, my father didn't ask if this man made me happy. He didn't ask what kind of person he was, or how he treated me, or whether he made me laugh. He asked one question: how much is he worth? When I told him Ethan was a high school teacher, my father's face twisted like I'd told him I was marrying a stranger off the street. To him, love had just become the single most embarrassing thing his family had ever produced. What happened at my wedding still haunts me sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep. But nothing compares to the look on my parents' faces 6 months later, in a boardroom they never expected me to set foot near again, when they discovered exactly who my husband really was. My name is Sophia Kingston, and this is the story of how my father tried to teach me a lesson about what money is worth, and ended up learning it himself, the hard way, from the one person he never saw coming. My father, Richard Kingston, owns one of the largest real estate empires in the country. Growing up in that house meant growing up around private jets, yacht clubs, and dinner parties where senators showed up as easily as neighbors show up at a barbecue. My father loved telling people I was born into greatness. He said it the way other parents say "I love you," like it was supposed to mean the same thing. By the time I was 24, he'd already picked out my future husband for me. Damien, the son of another billionaire, someone my father had done business with for years. Damien was handsome in the way expensive things are handsome polished, deliberate, built to be looked at. He was also cruel in a way my father somehow never noticed or never cared to. I watched him snap his fingers at waiters like they were furniture. I watched him talk about a homeless man outside a restaurant like the man's existence personally inconvenienced him. Once, at a dinner meant to celebrate our future, he introduced me to his business partners as the Kingston acquisition, and laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever said. My father adored him. I couldn't stand to be in the same room as him for longer than an hour. I met Ethan at a community literacy program I volunteered with on weekends, one of the only parts of my life my father never bothered attending, because there was no press coverage in it for him. Ethan was quiet in a way that took me a while to understand wasn't shyness. He was just genuinely more interested in listening than talking. He drove a pickup truck that was older than some of my father's wine collection. He lived in a small one-bedroom apartment near the school where he taught 10th grade English. He showed up to that literacy program every single Saturday, rain or shine, for kids who had nobody else showing up for them at all. He never once asked me a single question about my family's money. For months, I don't think he even knew who my father was. When I finally told my father I was seeing someone serious, he hired a private investigator before he'd even met the man. The report came back exactly the way my father wanted it to, in the sense that it gave him ammunition: no family wealth, no properties, no meaningful assets beyond a modest teacher's salary and a small savings account. My father slammed that folder down on his desk, so hard the sound echoed down the hallway. "A man like that only wants your inheritance," he said. I told him Ethan didn't even know I had one. My father laughed like I'd told the joke of the century. I refused to leave Ethan. So my father did what my father always does when something doesn't go his way. He tried to make the cost of disobedience too painful to bear. My credit card stopped working within a week. My trust fund was frozen the week after that. I was quietly removed from the family company's board, a position I'd held in name only since I was 22, but losing it still felt like watching a door close somewhere behind me. My mother, who I'd always hoped might be the softer one, the one who might understand, joined him instead. "If you marry that man," she told me over the phone, her voice flat in a way I'd never heard from her before, "don't ever call us Mom and Dad again." I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment after that call, staring at my phone, waiting for her to call back and take it back. She never did. Ethan and I got married anyway. Small ceremony, a rented garden space, folding chairs, flowers I'd arranged myself the night before because we couldn't afford a florist. It was without question the most beautiful day of my life up to that point. Then my father showed up. Nobody had invited him. For one hopeful, foolish moment, I thought maybe he'd come to make peace. Maybe some part of him had softened. Instead, he walked straight up to the small sound system set up for our vows, picked up the microphone meant for the officiant, and turned to face the entire room of guests. From this moment on, he announced, his voice carrying over 60 stunned faces, my daughter receives nothing. No inheritance, no trust fund, no family business. He paused, letting the silence stretch as long as he could make it. You've chosen poverty, so live in it. I have never in my life felt a room go that quiet. I started crying not out of shame, but out of a grief I didn't fully understand yet. The grief of watching a parent choose money over you in front of an entire room of witnesses. Everyone turned to look at Ethan, waiting, I think, for him to either fight back or fall apart. He did neither. He simply smiled, took my hand, and looked my father directly in the eyes. We don't need your money, he said. Calm, steady, like he'd been expecting this exact moment for a long time and had already decided, long before it happened, exactly how he'd respond to it. Then we walked away together. My father laughed behind us. So much pride. He called out for a poor man. We moved into a small apartment 2 blocks from Ethan's school. I got my first job in my entire adult life, a receptionist position at a dental office. Of all places, something so far from the world I'd grown up in that I actually cried the first time I got my paycheck, just from the strange, unfamiliar pride of having earned it myself. My old friends mostly disappeared. A few sent pitying texts about how sad it was to watch me throw everything away. A gossip column ran a piece calling me the billionaire's daughter who chose poverty, complete with a photo of me carrying groceries in the same coat I'd worn to my own engagement party. And somehow, underneath all of it, we were happy, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, in a way I never once was inside my father's mansion. But there was one thing about our new life I couldn't quite make sense of. Ethan left the apartment before sunrise most mornings and didn't come home until well past midnight. When I asked him what kept him out so late, teaching schedules didn't usually explain. He'd just smile and say, I'll tell you when the time is right. I told myself it was nothing. A second tutoring job? Maybe. Something he was too proud to admit he needed to make ends meet. I loved him too much to push. I had no idea how wrong that guess actually was. About 4 months into our marriage, something strange started happening. Small amounts of money would appear in my new bank account, never more than a few $100s at a time. Never with any note attached, from an account number I didn't recognize. I mentioned it to Ethan once, and he just shrugged and said maybe it was a banking error. I let it go, mostly because we genuinely didn't need it. Between his salary and mine, modest as it was, we were managing fine. It wasn't until months later, after everything else came out, that I finally learned where that money had actually come from. My mother. She'd never stopped loving me the way my father demanded she pretend to. She simply hadn't known how to say so without risking everything my father controlled. So instead, quietly, without his knowledge, she'd been siphoning small amounts from her own personal allowance money my father barely tracked because he considered it beneath his attention, and sending it to me anonymously. Just enough to know, without ever saying it out loud, that at least one parent hadn't fully let me go. I didn't know that yet. Not during those months. All I knew was that somewhere out there, someone still seemed to care, even if I couldn't prove who. 6 months after our wedding, my father walked into the most important business meeting of his career. His company was in worse shape than the public knew. A string of bad investments, an over-leveraged expansion into 3 new cities, and a board growing quieter and more nervous by the quarter had left Kingston Enterprises depending almost entirely on securing one enormous government redevelopment contract. Winning it would stabilize the company for a decade. Losing it could bankrupt entire divisions. The deciding meeting took place inside the headquarters of the country's most powerful infrastructure investment firm, the one group with the authority to approve or deny the funding his bid depended on. My father walked in confident, the way he always did, flanked by lawyers and analysts who'd spent 3 weeks preparing his pitch. Then the boardroom doors opened. Several executives walked in first. And behind them, dressed in a suit my father had never seen him wear, walked a man he recognized instantly and could not, for several long seconds, process at all. Ethan, not as a teacher, not as an assistant, not as a guest. He walked straight to the head of the table, and every single executive in that room stood as he passed. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," one of them said. My father froze completely. My mother, who'd come along for the announcement she assumed would finally be good news, nearly dropped her handbag. My poor husband, the man my father had investigated, mocked and publicly humiliated at our own wedding, was the newly appointed CEO and majority shareholder of the very investment firm, now deciding the fate of my father's entire company. I found out the full story that same night, sitting across from Ethan at our tiny kitchen table, the one we'd bought secondhand for $40 the week we moved in. Years before we ever met, Ethan had inherited a significant block of shares from his late grandfather, who had quietly built a stake in the investment firm decades earlier. Ethan could have stepped into a life of luxury the moment he turned 21. Instead, he chose to leave the shares mostly untouched, working with a small trust of advisors to grow them responsibly, while he built an entirely separate life teaching high school English and living on a teacher's salary he'd earned entirely on his own. He wanted to know, he told me, whether people could ever actually see him, not his money, not his name, just him, and the only way to find out was to make sure nobody around him knew there was money to see in the first place. "I wasn't hiding it to trick you," he said quietly. "I was hiding it because I'd spent my whole life watching people love the version of me that came with a balance sheet attached. I wanted one relationship that didn't. The late nights, it turned out, weren't a second job. They were board meetings, investor calls, and the slow, careful work of stepping into a CEO role he'd spent years training for in private, all while still showing up to teach 10th grade English every morning at 7:15. I wasn't angry. I understood, sitting there, exactly why he'd needed the secret to survive as long as it did. What I felt instead was something closer to awe, realizing the man I married had quietly chosen humility over comfort for years, just to make sure whatever we had was real. Word of Ethan's identity didn't stay contained for long. And it didn't take long for Damien to find an angle in it either. Damien had never forgiven me for choosing Ethan over him. Not because he'd actually loved me, but because losing me publicly to a man he'd once called the pickup truck teacher at a dinner party full of his friends had wounded his pride in a way money couldn't fix. When he learned Ethan controlled the firm deciding my father's contract, he saw an opportunity to fix two problems with one move: humiliate Ethan and win back my father's favor by saving the deal. 2 weeks before the final funding decision, an anonymous tip landed in 3 different financial publications, alleging that Ethan's firm had a conflict of interest, that Ethan was steering the contract toward my father's company, specifically to repair his marriage's public image, with forged internal memos attached as proof. For about 48 hours, it worked. Reporters called our apartment. A congressional oversight committee even sent a preliminary inquiry letter to the firm's compliance office. Then the firm's internal investigators traced the forged memos back to their source, and the story fell apart in exactly the opposite direction Damien had planned. The forensic digital trail wasn't subtle once anyone actually looked for it. The memos had been created using a template pulled from Damien's own company's internal server, time-stamped from a laptop registered to his personal assistant, sent through a proxy account Damien had used before in a completely unrelated matter, 2 years earlier when he'd been quietly investigated and never charged for pressuring a former business partner using similarly fabricated documents. That old, buried investigation resurfaced almost immediately once reporters realized the forgery pattern matched. Damien hadn't just tried to sabotage Ethan out of jealousy. He'd used the exact same playbook he'd apparently used before, on someone else, to manufacture leverage he didn't actually have. And this time, because the target was a federally regulated investment firm instead of a private business dispute, the fallout was public, fast, and impossible to quietly settle. Ethan, to his credit, didn't gloat. He didn't even comment publicly. He simply forwarded the entire forensic file to the appropriate regulators, recused himself completely from any further involvement in my father's contract decision, to avoid even the appearance of conflict, and let an independent committee take over the final vote. My father's bid was reviewed fairly, on its actual merits, by people who had never even met Ethan. It lost anyway, not because of revenge, not because of sabotage, but because a competing firm had simply submitted a stronger, better costed proposal. My father's own years of over-leveraged expansion and thinning cash reserves had already done most of the damage, long before Ethan ever walked into that boardroom. My father tried, almost immediately, to act like none of the last 6 months had happened. He invited Ethan to dinner, called him son for the first time in his life, in a tone that made my skin crawl with how easily it came to him now that it was useful. He even offered to restore my trust fund, my board seat, all of it, like a switch he could flip back on whenever it suited him. Ethan smiled politely through the entire dinner. Then, near the end, he set down his fork and looked my father directly in the eyes, the same way he had at our wedding. "You disowned Sophia," he said, "because you believed money made a person valuable." He paused just long enough for the words to land. "The irony is, you only respect me now because you think I have more of it than you." The table went completely silent. My mother stared at her plate. My father's jaw tightened, but for the first time in my entire life, I watched him have absolutely nothing to say back. Losing the contract was the beginning of the end for my father's empire, not the whole story. The deal had been the last major piece, keeping several overextended divisions afloat. Within a year, 2 subsidiaries filed for restructuring. Longtime board members quietly resigned. The wealthy friends who'd filled every one of his birthday parties for decades stopped returning his calls almost overnight, the way people do when your usefulness to them runs out. My mother told me later that the hardest part for my father wasn't the money. It was watching, in real time, exactly how many of the relationships he'd spent his life building had only ever been made of money in the first place. Ethan and I, meanwhile, kept living the way we always had, modestly, quietly, investing what we could into scholarship funds and the same literacy program where we'd first met, rather than chasing any of the status my father had spent his whole life chasing instead. Almost a year after the wedding that had once made national tabloid headlines, my father showed up at our apartment door, alone. No driver waiting outside. No entourage, no expensive suit pressed to perfection. Just an older, smaller-looking man than the one who'd once grabbed a microphone to disown me in front of 60 guests. "I thought wealth made a family strong," he said quietly, standing in our doorway like he wasn't sure he had the right to step through it. I looked at him for a long moment at the father who taught me, without meaning to, exactly what love wasn't supposed to look like, and I finally understood something I don't think I could have said out loud 6 months earlier. "No, Dad," I told him. "It was love. We were the rich ones all along. You just never noticed, because you were the one keeping score." I didn't slam the door. I didn't invite him in for dinner either. I left it open, not because the last year was forgotten, not because an apology fixes what a microphone and a room full of witnesses once broke, but because forgiveness, when it finally comes, has to happen on the terms of the person who was hurt, not the person who's finally realized what they lost.